Game developers tend to make big efforts to make games as realistic as possible. How far should we go with this strive for realism? Today's multi-million-dollar AAA leisure games with their ever-growing realism of high-definition graphics and animations inevitably set the standard for how game scenes are supposed to look like. Educational games, however, cannot afford such massive budgets. They're typically low-budget, low-tech. As a consequence, educational games may have difficulties in meeting the player's expectations. Yet, graphical realism is not always needed in serious games. It can even be counterproductive. Let's see why we can waive those high-resolution graphics in serious games. Well, let's first have a look at PacMan. This classical game goes all the way back to 1979 and marks the emergence of the computer games market. PacMan players have to cross a maze while being chased by diverse ghosts. The ghosts may not quite look like ghosts, as they are represented by very few colored pixels, but in the game they are frightening as such and support exciting gameplay. This is pretty odd. The graphics are quite sloppy, and yet the game was a hit and it is still fun to play. So why don't we need realism here? A few mechanisms may account for that. First, media equation theory. Media equation theory says that we treat technical artifacts as living beings. That's why we curse to our computer when we're stuck. And that's why a few pixels or shapes on the screen are just enough to evoke our interpersonal responses. Our brain takes any object for a character, no matter how it looks like. This is because we cannot distinguish between mediated and non-mediated experiences. The human brain simply lacks the neural circuits and anatomic areas to distinguish between a dynamic artifact and a social object. Another concept is also in play: the willing suspension of disbelief. The willing suspension of disbelief is about our ability to accept an unrealistic starting point. For instance, Superman can't fly. Of course he can't, but we are willing to suspend our critical judgment in favor of a good storytelling experience. If you accept that the few colored pixels are evil ghosts that try to get you, you will have a good time playing PacMan. So we don't need high-resolution graphics. But once you stop suspending your disbelief about the ghost and say that these are just stupid pixels, you will no longer be enjoying the game. A third reason why we can do without realistic details has to do with our brain's limited processing capacity. Our brain is very busy arranging the perception and processing of all details from a crowded game scene. We should simplify it to avoid information overload. We could even do with simple drawn characters. It leaves more room in our brain to learn new things. After all, the key element is credibility, not realism. Players can easily suspend their disbelief and accept the simple scene as a credible office. Finally, I wish to point out the so-called uncanny valley effect, which also says that we don't need realism in a game. The basic idea of the uncanny valley is that the more an object looks like a human, the bigger is our emotional response. But when the resemblance is getting almost perfect, it suddenly becomes scary and our emotions turn negative. This sudden gap is the uncanny valley. If it's hard to tell whether a character is real or artificial, we get confused and alarmed. Therefore, in games, often simple drawings would do. It saves a lot of money as well. Overall, there are quite some arguments suggesting that we can do without high-resolution realism. The media equation theory, the willing suspension of disbelief, our brain's limited processing capacity, and the uncanny valley effect, all suggesting that we can do without realistic details. This is good news for serious games, as we don't need those large AAA budgets.